Now, let's talk to Sir John Redwood MP. He's Conservative for Wokingham, of course. The Bank of England put their interest rates up for the 14th consecutive time yesterday. An awful lot of people, including Richard Tice there, saying, what on earth are they thinking? How much more of this interest rate rise is going to stop inflation? It clearly doesn't seem to be working at the moment. John, a very good morning to you. Lots of people wondering when the government will put the brakes on the economy, if they can. Andrew Bailey doesn't seem to think he can control inflation. A lot of people think that yesterday's rise was a rise too far.
It may well prove to be so. I mean, I find it very surprising that the bank wants to carry on flying blind as it is, because it's told us that it doesn't trust its own forecasts and it thinks its model has been wrong. We can see for ourselves that it's been wildly wrong about inflation and growth for the last 3 or 4 years. And I would have thought what they should have done at that last meeting was sat down and had a really good session over how do they improve their models and their forecasts. Because until they can, with confidence, tell us what inflation is going to do, it's very difficult to know how they can set interest rates.
Yes. And also with the government giving pay rises out willy-nilly to members of the public sector, they've now settled with teachers, they've settled with nurses, they haven't yet settled with doctors, but, you know, they're giving out a lot of public money, billions and billions of pounds. They're giving out plenty of tax rises for things like alcohol. Surely that would be considered inflationary, while the Bank of England's putting up interest rates.
Well, I've been urging the government to be using tax reductions to help bring the inflation rate down. I think the whole approach to inflation by the bank and the Treasury is very flawed. I mean, the bank produced a rationale for increasing interest rates, and it said it needed to drive demand down, and so it was going to hit mortgage payers more so that people with mortgages had less money to spend. Well, why do they pick on just the mortgage holders? And hasn't it occurred to them that at the same time that they were taking money away from the mortgage holders, they are presumably giving the many millions more that are savers some extra money, because we presume we get more interest on our savings. Now they put the rates up. So how does that work, Bank of England? How are you actually getting demand down when you're stealing from the mortgage holders and giving the money to the savers?
Yes. Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Because, I mean, while I'm not unsympathetic to people whose mortgages are going up, I mean, it is unfortunately par for the course. You and I are old enough to remember when buying a house wasn't an automatic guarantee of making money. You know, sometimes the interest rate went up, sometimes you had to sell the house at a loss. Sometimes when you enter the home purchasing market, things go wrong. You know, so I'm not one of those that thinks the government should be helping people out. I was listening to a Liberal MP, a Lib Dem MP, Christine Jardine this morning talking on Breakfast, saying, you know, people through no fault of their own are paying more money for their mortgages. Well, you know, I'm not one who says the government should be helping people out with that. You know, that's the market. And if prices come down as a result, then that's probably a good thing, isn't it?
Well, I agree that government shouldn't be subsidising people against market movements in prices. But what we're talking about here, Mike, is the Bank of England rigging interest rates, as it is entitled to do. That's its main job. And we're entitled to ask it, are you rigging it in the right way? We know we just lived through a period when the Bank of England depressed interest rates far too far, diddling all the savers and giving us some massive inflation. There's now the danger they're going to do the opposite. They're going to stick interest rates up too high, hitting all the mortgage holders and all the businesses trying to expand on borrowed money, and giving us much more of a downturn than we need or we deserve. I want them to get it right, and they must start, surely, Mike, by doing some better homework on their economics. They've got all these very highly paid, clever economists there. Why can't they produce a model that can start predicting things more accurately? Their test should be, can they get their model to predict what has happened? Because we know that over the last 2 or 3 years, their model was so far out. So please, Bank, fix your model immediately, and then we'd have more confidence in your judgments.
Well, I mean, I must say, the banking business has gone a long way from the big bang that I remember back in the 80s when everything was much more hunky-dory than it is now. And the banks were actually quite good at their jobs. They were good at making money. They were good at making money for their customers. They were good at lending money to their customers in a safe and balanced way. But in the past sort of couple of decades, they seem to have forgotten how to do it. They seem more interested in telling you that they've got a gender-neutral toilet than they've actually got a decent kind of vault full of gold.
Well, and of course the banks were misled into bad ways of lending a lot of money to projects that weren't going to work very well and to companies that are going to find it very difficult to repay that money. by the Bank of England, Federal Reserve Board, and the ECB. All three of those central banks have made the same mistakes, deliberately depressing interest rates and saying to the banks, go on, have a jamboree, just lend any money, any amounts you like. And of course, the banks allowed the governments to borrow the most enormous sums of money at somewhere near zero interest. Well, who wouldn't find it exciting to borrow at zero interest? So the mistakes all go back to those central banks. And we know that they didn't have to do it because the world's second biggest economy, China, and the world's fourth biggest economy, Japan, have inflation at very low levels now because they didn't have banks that went on this huge money spree that the European Central Bank, the Bank of England and the Fed did.
That is the problem, isn't it? I mean, how do you see the way of the next 6 months, the end of this year? We're told that 5% is probably a level that interest rates will not dip below. There's an awful lot of people who are struggling to get by. There's an awful lot of people facing these new ULEZ charges, which are going to come in London and possibly other parts of the country as well. The government, meanwhile, is heading on, and Rishi Sunak's trying to convince us all that he's getting things done. But is he really?
Well, yeah, I think the Prime Minister's getting done what he can get done, but the Bank of England background is not at all helpful, and I think the Treasury have got to change their approach. I think we need from the Treasury now tax cuts that promote more growth. The bank wants to do it all by hitting demand, particularly hitting the demand that people with borrowings would otherwise be releasing into the economy. I think they need to do much more by supply. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Well, there's not a lot of money left now. The money growth is way down. So what we need is some more supply, and that's where tax cuts and positive policies for individual sectors like farming could be very helpful. Let's stop the wilding grants and give grants to people to grow more food.
Yeah.
Let's have an energy policy which does really get on with getting the oil and gas out of the UK. When I see the Prime Minister's announced more exploration licences, but what he needs to do is have production licences, because there are several well-established, well-known fields out there that don't have licences to produce the oil and gas.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? And as much as you might say to oil and gas companies, please come back to the North Sea, people have said to me that the infrastructure there isn't what it was, so they'd have to be building new rigs and possibly new, pieces of equipment to look for the oil and the gas. And also, how could you guarantee, for example, that if Labour win the next election, they don't suddenly hit them with some kind of windfall tax?
Well, that's the danger, and we've already got a big windfall tax. And again, I would ask the Treasury to look at that, because I think if it is a genuine windfall tax, it should come off when the oil prices come down. But it didn't do that. The oil prices came back a long way, but the windfall tax remained at the same level. And as you rightly say, that is a deterrent to investment. But I come back to this simple proposition that a number of companies have spent a lot of money on drilling exploration wells, and they've discovered quite big fields out there, but they still haven't got the permits and the go-ahead to get on and produce the oil and gas. Surely that should be number one priority of this government. It needs more tax revenue, and that would also create some well-paid jobs and substitute for expensive imports. And
Rishi Sunak does appear to have kind of signalled that he's willing to move slightly on the net zero commitments and possibly postpone some of them. Is that the right thing to do from your point of view?
Well, I think it's quite wrong to undertake policies that actually increase world carbon dioxide at the expense of British industry and commerce. And we have too many of those sort of policies. That's why I've been a strong advocate of getting our own oil and gas out of the ground, because not only does it produce jobs, money and tax revenue here, but it reduces world CO2, because LNG is much more CO2 intensive than just getting your gas direct from a field down a pipe. And I think we need to reverse the bans on gas boilers and on certain types of car from 2030. I don't think that's going to help at all. I think, again, we'll end up with more imports and more world CO2.
Exactly right. Finally, Sir John, what do you make of the Greenpeace demonstration outside or inside and clambering around over Rishi Sunak's home in North Yorkshire? I'm staggered, as many people are, that there was no kind of police protection there, that anybody could have apparently done exactly what they did with perhaps more malevolent plans, As an MP, I presume this is something, your own security is something you worry about.
Well, I don't want to personalise it, but I think particularly for somebody like the Prime Minister, yes, of course, he deserves proper support from the security services. And I hope now there will be a plan put in place to protect his own private residence in Yorkshire. I think everybody is horrified by that, apart from a small group who support this kind of very difficult protest. And I was very pleased to see Labour came out very strongly along with the government saying that really we must do better than this.
Yeah, but I mean, surely whatever the residence is, if it is something that belongs to the Prime Minister, it should be guarded 24/7, shouldn't it?
Well, I don't want to go into the details of how they should do it, but I think everybody will agree that they need to do something better than they did last time. Yeah. To allow people to walk in with all this equipment and change the look of the house and get up on the roof. Just beggars belief, doesn't it? So we need to do better than that.
No, absolutely right. So John Redwood, thank you very much indeed, Conservative MP for Wokingham, of course.